The early years of the 20th century were filled with exciting inventions, creative innovations, and expanded perspectives on the human experience. Electricity worked its way into more homes. Automobiles began to replace the horse and carriage at an increasing rate, and man broke free from the earth, taking mechanically powered flight for the first time. Inventions altered the way of life, an effect that it shares with war. Often through war, the inventions of the day see further development of new and innovative usage. The Great War would be no exception to this, seeing many vehicular technologies of the day expanded upon to fulfill new roles and serve alternative purposes. Over land, sea, and air, combat would evolve throughout the Great War, seeing new innovations and techniques developed that would remain on the battlefield a century later. The soldiers on the Western Front had found themselves in a stalemate, as trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire left combatants on both sides of the battlefield in a defensive stance. Although the basic concepts behind the tank had existed before the war, it would be with the invention of tracked mobility, however, that the British would gain an interest in the massive armored vehicles that became to be known as tanks. Weighing in at 28 tons, one early tank would excel at the tests placed before it. This behemoth, affectionately called Big Willie, stood 8 feet tall, 13 feet wide, and 31 feet long. Big Willie would impose fright in the hearts of its enemies on the battlefield. Its tracked momentum made short work of barbed wire, and its armor protected against the heavy fire of the machine guns of the day. One German observer would describe his first encounter with a British tank, noting the horror, declaring that, "My blood froze in my veins. Crawling along the cratered battlefield were two mysterious monsters. The monsters approached slowly, limping, staggering, swaying, but no obstacle could stop them. They moved ever forward with a supernatural force. Our machine gun fire and hand grenades simply bounced off them." The final battles of the war would see tanks ultimately become the most decisive factor in Allied victory. Naval combat has an incredibly long history, and the traditions of war at sea would remain throughout the Great War. Submarines had been attempted with limited and mixed results in past conflicts, but World War I would see them reach a level of competency that resulted in destruction and lethality as they had never achieved before. German submarines became a dominant force in the seas early in the war, with their impact being recognized by Rear Admiral Gordon Campbell, who stated that the fact remains that the submarine became one of the most, if not the most, important weapon during the war, and what was called the submarine menace loomed very large in many big problems of the war. The advancements that had made submarines such a lethal weapon would be countered by British artists, who decorated ships with a peculiar paint job. Through the use of painted, angular, erratic patterns on ships, a new form of camouflage was put to the test. One that would not hide ships, as was impossible to do against the backdrops of the sea and sky, but one that would confuse observers. This razzle-dazzle camouflage, as it was referred to at the time, left British observers stating that it was almost impossible to say how she was steering, and that ships sometimes appear to be going in the opposite direction. Ever since the Wright brothers achieved flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, there was nowhere left for man to go but up. The typical military airplane at the beginning of World War I was unarmed, slow, fragile, mechanically unreliable, and capable of carrying only enough fuel for a short flight. Changes in aviation would grow exponentially during the war, and by 1915, planes were equipped with machine guns. The Germans would develop a synchronization gear that would fire a bullet between the propeller blade. This would eliminate the risk of damage, and soon after, the Allied forces would copy this design. Weapons were not the only advancement made. The design of planes advanced as well. Innovations were made to increase fuel capacity and efficiency, allowing for longer flights, plane stability, and reliability. In addition to these gains would be production of specialty planes, such as two-seat observation models and larger bombers. While these early aerial assaults were primitive and their effectiveness limited to the technologies of the time, they were effective enough to spawn an origin for the further evolution of later fighters, bombers, and weapon loads. The face of modern combat would see its birth upon and over the battlefields of World War I. Tanks have remained an active and integral role for ground forces into the modern day, and they remain a constant presence in every modern army. The Great War demonstrated how, even in their infancy, the value of heavily armored and weaponized vehicles could prevent stalemates and become an awesome offensive force. Submarines and various styles of battleships find regular usage in navies all over the world. Although the razzle-dazzle camouflage of the past is no longer in use, the advancements made in both submarine and anti-torpedo defense systems would originate in World War I. Although previous attempts at aerial advantages had occurred in the past, with the U.S. Balloon Corps of the American Civil War being one early example, it would not be until the invention of the airplane that aerial combat and operations, instead of mere low-level observations, could be made. Planes of the era, such as the infamous Sopwith Camel or the Fokker, were the forebearers of modern combat jets, such as the MiG or the F-16 or the F-35. Today's modern combat vehicles carry on the legacy of innovation that originated and was developed throughout the course of World War I. These evolved vehicles of modern combat are the direct descendants of those originating during the Great War, seeing the combat innovations of a century before linger into the present.